So good evening or good afternoon, good morning to you all. A very, very warm welcome to this online conversation about the power of narratives. My name is Mathieu Lefevre. I am the co-founder and CEO of an organization called More in Common that works to unite divided societies. It is such a pleasure to welcome you all today. I thought we were all zoomed out after the last 18 months and I was worried nobody would turn up. But I am very glad to see so many people attending. Over 100 people signed up for this session and they're joining us from all over the world today. So it's very exciting to see 150, I'm told. We are going to dive right into the conversation in just under 5 minutes, but to set us up, I wanted to say 4 quick things very quickly. The first thing I wanted to say is to explain why we at More in Common felt the urge to work on a project about the story of the future. Our work is much more focused on today than it is on tomorrow. For those of you who don't know us, the bulk of our work is spent looking for ways to reinforce what we have in common as people, as societies, to try to understand and to heal divisions. We produce quite detailed opinion research on social division. We've worked on immigration. We've worked on climate as a unifying narrative. We've worked on democracy, and we work with over 100 partners all over the world to find ways to bring people and societies together. So as I was saying, our work is really typically very focused on the here and now. For example, right now we're working on the impact of the pandemic on trust, on the trust that people place in one another, people place in their governments. And broadly, one of the things that we've found in interviews with over 50,000 people is that in spite of very real and very dangerous tensions, people still, by and large, think that their divisions can be overcome, that they still want to form a bigger us, if you will. And that is, I think, an encouraging finding and one that is a useful starting point for us, that people still want to move together to overcome our collective challenges. Think of the pandemic or climate. So then the question really becomes, they want to come together, but for what? Is there, in fact, a common vision of society, a societal project, if you will, that could both unite large majorities that go far beyond the usual suspects and shape a project that is able to galvanize our energies so that we can address the very real challenges we face? And importantly, a question that's interesting for us is, can the act of turning our gaze together towards that tomorrow, can that act of doing it together help bridge our divides today? These are some of the questions we wanted to investigate and also why we launched the project we are going to discuss today, which is called The Endless Sea. And we're going to post a link in the chat right now to the project and the project resources for you to see. The name Endless Sea comes from a quote that's attributed to the author of The Little Prince, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry was a pilot, an explorer, a traveler, somebody very used to going into the unknown. And the quote says, "If you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea." That's where we got the name. The second thing I wanted to say is that I am very aware of the limits of such an exercise. Who gets to opine on the future is an eminently political question. And the contribution that we've made and the discussion we're going to have today really should only serve as an invitation to hear from others with other worldviews, from other perspectives and life experiences. For example, I'm very aware that much of the work we've done so far draws mainly from examples in the global north, just because that is where we at More in Common work. But we certainly need to hear, including from all of you, who are working on similar initiatives in other contexts. So please accept this conversation today as a first draft, as a starting place, and not in any way as a definitive story of tomorrow. The third thing to say is that we could not have dreamed of better partners to launch on this experiment than our speakers today, Laurence Tubiana and Giuliano da Empoli. Their bios are far too illustrious to list in any detail here, but many of you know Laurence Tubiana, who's one of the leading global voices on climate. She is the CEO of the European Climate Foundation and one of the key architects of the Paris Climate Accords. And she is also chair of the board of the French Development Agency and many other things. And she was a co-chair of the much discussed French Citizens Assembly on Climate. If there ever was a Renaissance man, then surely it must be Giuliano da Empoli, who is a senior fellow at Common and the main author of the report we put out and that you can find in the chat. We called it Imagining a Story of Tomorrow. Giuliano is a widely cited author and political advisor. He is the founding chairman of Volta, a think tank based in Milan. He was deputy of mayor of Florence for culture, no less, in Florence, and then was later an advisor to Prime Minister Renzi. He's published many books, the last being called The Engineers of Chaos, which was about national populist spin doctors. So on behalf of More in Common, and speaking very personally, I want to really thank Laurence. I want to thank the European Climate Foundation and Giuliano for joining us on this project. The final thing I want to say is that over the last 18 months, I don't know about you, but I've felt, not always, but certainly at times, a deep sense of dread at the state of the world. And I know many of you felt this too. Lockdowns, downturns, the hardship and suffering felt by so many around the world, droughts, fires, Afghanistan, and the different pressures that we've all felt have certainly not made the last 18 months the happiest in our lives. But speaking very personally, this project, The Endless Sea, brought a lot of joy and energy to me and to the team at More in Common in this very dark period. And here too, I want to thank everybody who worked on this. I want to thank all of the people we talked to about this project. I hope that that sense of joy and energy and curiosity comes through in the conversation, which we will start right now. So off we go onto the Endless Sea. What we're going to do is to hear from Giuliano first, to tell us, so that he can tell us what he found on his travels. And then we're going to have a conversation and a reaction from Laurence. And then we will open up for a discussion with all of you. I see more and more people are joining, which is great. Please use the chat function to share any thoughts and particularly questions, but also comments and projects or work that you and others are doing in this space. What we will do is we will download the chat and share all the resources that are put in there. So please do use the chat, and we will send that round. So thank you again for being with us, and Giuliano, over to you.
Thank you, Mathieu, for this excessively generous introduction, even if I guess when you say I'm a Renaissance man, you mean I'm low tech, because I haven't evolved much from the Renaissance technology. So I don't really have special effects and presentations for you today. I will just talk to you for about 10 minutes about some of the results of our explorations and travels. So the starting point for the Endless Sea project is it's actually quite simple. It's a scene from a famous movie that some of you might know. It's The Graduate by Mike Nichols, and it's a scene where Dustin Hoffman, who plays Ben, the main character, he just graduated, and he's at a party. His parents threw a party for him, and basically he's wondering what he should do with the rest of his life. And so there's an old family friend at this party, Mr. McGuire, and he takes him. He's actually towering over him, and he takes him under his arm and takes him a bit away from the other people, and tells him, "You're thinking about your future. I have just one word for you." And so the guy, Dustin Hoffman, looks at him a bit perplexed and skeptical, and he said, "Just one word: plastics. The future is plastics." And I think this scene, which is an old scene, explains a lot of the current political situation in all kind of countries and places. Because today mainstream politicians are a bit like Mr. McGuire. Of course, they don't say plastics anymore. They might say renewables at this stage. So this kind of evolution has happened. But even if you answer renewables to the question of the graduate, you're still giving a functional answer to an existential question. Lots of people, not just young people, asking for meaning. They're asking for how they should live, especially now during this existential crisis of the pandemic that we've been going through all together. And the mainstream and traditional leaders, the answer is mostly not plastics, but renewables, but something that goes into a PowerPoint slide. And that's why I'm not presenting a PowerPoint slide to you today. I'm actually leading a small crusade against PowerPoint slides, but that's not the subject of today's chat. And on the other side, national populist, authoritarian, radical identitarian movements, they offer much more exciting answers to the graduate question, and answers that resonate because they deal with pride, with meaning, with roots, with all kind of things that move people. So the Endless Sea project is about trying to provide a different kind of answer. And of course, lots of people are trying, lots of people have already tried, and I'm not saying that we will come up with the answer, which would be ridiculous, but at least we're trying to assemble some elements of that motivating vision of the future that we call somehow a kind of narrative moonshot. And so the first thing that you notice when you look around and you look at narratives about the future is that negative ones are much more successful than positive ones. It's not just about politics. You just look at movies, you look at TV series or books. Dystopias and catastrophes are all over the place because they attract much more attention and they sell better. And of course, even in the climate field, we need those kind of narratives because somehow they get people attentions. But the reason why they prevail and they get more attention than positive narratives is it's not by chance. It's not a cyclical fact. It's a structural element. It's part of our biology. As humans, we developed in a world full of dangers, and so it's our biological interest to overreact to threats, and that's why even today our attention goes more to bad news and pessimistic narratives at the expense of positive visions. Negative stories activate our reptilian brain. They're very effective in this, but all they do is suggesting fight or flight. The problem is you can't really build a transformative project on them. You can't generate a real desire for change. If Martin Luther King only had a nightmare, the history of civil rights movement might have been different in the States. And this is somehow the first big theme that we encountered while working on this project. I call it the big switch from negative to positive. You need to make that switch from negative to positive at one point if you want to motivate people and call them to action. But that big switch almost always produces a drop in energy. And I think that's a fundamental issue for people who work to produce change in the climate field, on immigration, on social issues, or to fight polarization like More in Common does, because we're trying to come up with all these arguments to bring people together. And of course, we poll people about them, and large majorities agree with them. But then the problem is nobody really cares about nice, balanced arguments, because they don't generate enough energy. Producing positive narratives about the future is not particularly difficult in and of itself. What is really difficult is that they contain enough energy to first grab the attention and then really mobilize the people they're directed at. So we don't just need high positivity, we also need high energy. And so that's what we did with the Endless Sea project. We tried to look at individuals, at groups, at movements that have managed to overcome this problem, that have been able to produce an energetic and positive message. And of course, we went a bit wild with this. You'll find the case histories on the Endless Sea website. We looked at political campaigns, we looked at huge global movements, of course, like Fridays for Future and others, but we also looked at tiny little local movements. We looked at local political campaigns like the Istanbul campaign for mayor. We looked at pranksters like the Yes Men. We looked at amusement parks for kids. We looked at festivals in the Nevada desert. We looked at all kind of different cases. And after looking at all kind of cases, we came up with a list of 6 factors, which I call intensifiers, that make it possible to achieve the big switch from negative to positive without losing energy, but rather generating a new form of energy. So I will quickly now, a few minutes, go through these 6 intensifiers. And of course, the number 6 is arbitrary. I mean, we could have found 8 or we could have found 4, and probably maybe some of you have more in mind, but we settled for 6 for now. The first one is what we call the fun factor, which is a need for a sense of play, a festive dimension that can turn democracy and equality into an experience, not just an idea. And of course, this is fundamental for all kinds of movements, not just for good progressive ones, but also for conservative ones. It's been fundamental for the anti-gay marriage movement in France. It's been fundamental for some anti-immigration movements throughout Europe. The point is, we look at these movements, even some of the most regressive of these movements, and we imagine they're all about rage and fear. But then if you go into the experience of the people that are actually part of these movements, you understand that the success of some of those radical, even nationalist and xenophobe movements is often based on a component of community, of celebration, of fun, of belonging to something. And there's been research by More in Common on the group of the French so-called left behinds, and it shows a deep longing among them for gatherings and communal events and national festivals, school and village festivals, professional festivals. And they're all seen as an opportunity to get out of one's daily life and meet different people. And we need to take this into account. Whatever story of the future we want to tell, it can't be done with a set of PowerPoint slides. It needs to be warmer than that, even if it's a bit messier than that, like this introduction. We don't have to be afraid of messy. We have to be afraid of cold, of not generating the energy that we need. Then the second intensifier we looked at is what we call prefiguration. Of course, one of the most effective ways to overcome the loss of energy that goes with a big switch from negative to positive visions of the future is to give a physical dimension to the future, to embody it in collective and concrete objects and experiences, so that you can bring the future to life, to the point that people can see it, they can feel it, they can taste it, they can smell it. There's a quote by James Baldwin about this, which I think I probably lost. No, it's here. And he says, the world changes according to the way people see it. And if you can alter even by a millimeter the way people look at reality, then you can change the world. And this, of course, means that change requires, first of all, an incredible effort of imagination, not only to conceive the future, but also to make it tangible, that you can touch it. So we've looked at kids' part, like Kidzania, where kids are invited. So it's a Mexican chain of theme parks where kids are invited to experience their own future. It's a whole world built at their measure. We've looked at design fiction experiments. There's an IKEA catalog from the future, where a group of Swiss designers from Geneva, they try to imagine what an IKEA catalog in 2050 might look like. And of course, that helps you visualize a certain kind of future in a very concrete way. There's this amazing group of pranksters, the Yes Men, and they're into reality correction. So basically, they do pranks as if corporations were going to do the right things, as if politicians were going to do the right thing. If you only have to look at one of the case histories that we've produced with the Endless Sea, please look at the Yes Men if you don't know them, because they're an amazing duo. Of course, movements and political movements and social movements at their best have been able to do this as well. Occupy Wall Street has been capable of doing this at one point. Reclaim the Streets has been able to do this at one point. Some local administrations have been able to somehow give a physical incarnation to what they're doing against climate change, for example. If you think of the ski slope over that recycling establishment in Copenhagen. So prefiguration, objects, materialization of the future is the second intensifier. The third one, my favorite, is transgression. And this is about when you have such a high level of rage and dissatisfaction in society, you need somehow to produce some kind of disruption. and this is not only part of the charm of disruptors and carnival figures like Trump or Bolsonaro or people like that. It's also, it can also be used to convey a positive message. For example, if you think about Fridays for Future, do we really think that if in August 2018 Greta Thunberg had just said, well, let's do a nice little march for climate on Saturday after school, would it have worked the same way as it worked by her saying, transgressing the let's say I mean the rule of going to school, and launching a school strike for climate? This element of transgressing of the status quo and of breaking the rules, of course, has been decisive in the success of her movement. And so even people who are not national populists, even people who are not pushing for that agenda, they have to take it into account that the dissatisfaction and the rage against the system is so strong in this phase that you always need an element of transgression to make your message heard and to make your message strong. The fourth intensifier is what we have called the unlikely heroes. Of course, we all know that we live now in a world where an increasing number of people don't trust the traditional opinion leaders, authorities, scientists, the media, etc. But it goes much deeper than this. It's not just about rejecting verticality and authority that comes from above. It's almost an epistemological change in this atmosphere that we are in most societies. People dismiss facts when they don't fit in their own worldview, so it's completely pointless to add more facts to try to convince them. The only thing that's respected and that's valid is personal experience. Most people think that facts can be manipulated, while in some way, first-hand experiences, they keep having a special aura. Someone that speaks from personal experience is much more credible than someone that's just like stating facts. And it gives them this special aura, and that's why on so many issues that are at the center of today's debate, from immigration again to climate change, and that are mostly addressed by the relatively ineffective arguments made by experts and figures of authorities, a pressing need we have is to identify the most suitable trusted messengers, people with the right personal experience that makes them effective in conveying a message of change that is credible in the eyes of the public. The fifth intensifier is what we have called a bit provokingly the narcissist as a change maker. This is how you use selfie culture to produce change. In Europe and in the US, every year risky selfies claim more victims than terrorism, meaning there are more people that die trying to impress their friends by taking a spectacular selfie than from the hands of, for example, terrorist acts. And of course, this is an extreme example, but the point is that this permanent need to put oneself at the center of a stage has changed our position in the world. Scholars who observe this phenomenon, they tend to focus on the most negative effects and aspects of this. But really, behind this aspiration to be the protagonist of one's own film, of one's own life, there's a need for recognition. There's a desire to recover a form of agency over one's own life, which we can't underestimate. So this focus on the user experience, it's obvious for most NGOs and climate movements. You focus on the role that each one of your members can have, because you know that's fundamental for them. But it's completely unknown to politics. If you're a young person and you want to go into politics today, the user experience you have is more or less the same that it was 50 years ago. Maybe a couple more tweets, but that's more or less the thing. And so that's, I think, another fundamental thing to look at. And then the sixth intensifier that we've been looking at is empathic leadership. Unfortunately, the way it unfolds, political competition in our countries tends to select mostly narcissistic leaders, not just political competition, actually, competition in all kinds of fields. And their dominant characteristic is precisely the inability to feel empathy, which is a huge problem, because we live in fractured societies in which it's not just different opinions that clash, but radically contrasting worldviews. And in a situation like this, empathy is an essential skill to help build emotional bridges between different groups. Of course, research on gender and empathy has shown that women tend to be more empathetic towards others than men. I don't think it's by chance that movements and cases we've examined in our case histories mostly are led by women, and in politics as well. We've seen the rise of a new generation of female leaders, and for example, there's all kind of even scientific evidence that they've performed much better during the COVID period. There's research about, for example, governors of the 50 American states that proves that states that were governed by female governors have had less cases and less death, and that's probably because of a less hubristic way of governing and the ability to correct your own mistakes. And but of course, I mean, empathic leadership can be practiced by men as well. And we have we've looked at a fascinating case of the campaign for mayor of Istanbul, who ran a very difficult campaign against the national government of Erdogan, all based on love in a very tough environment. So that's another case that I would invite you to have a look at. So these are the 6 intensifiers we looked at. Again, of course, they're not the only ones. We could have looked at others, but the takeaway is that when you want to put forward a positive vision about the future, you can't just focus on the content. You need to focus on how to inject it with enough energy to really produce an impact. Not just high positivity, but high energy. Then, of course, there's a whole second part of the research we've been doing. I'll be very, very quick about this because I think I'm already over time. I think our hypothesis there we focused on the content, not just on the form of what a positive narrative about the future should be. And again, our basic hypothesis is that if in the 90s political competition was about policies, and after the financial crisis it became about a political competition about identity, now we're entering a stage of existential politics. And it's a bit like the 60s, where there was this idea that you had to reinvent daily life. And of course, this is not about a revival of the hippie movement. We're trying to look at something that will be appealing to a majority of people, but that might be precisely the point. Too many people don't really know how to live anymore, and it's not just the left behinds. It's a lot of people like us who are caught in a spiral of constant acceleration, who spend most of our lives in front of screens. And when you spend your whole day in front of your screen, what have you done with your life? And what are you doing with your life? So I don't want to push you to disconnect from this webinar. Maybe you can start thinking about this when we're done. But I think there's a huge scope for this kind of thinking as well. And since you mentioned the Renaissance in your introduction, Mathieu, I think what they used to do back in the days, the map makers and the navigators, when they didn't know what was somewhere, on their maps beyond one point, they would draw little figures of lions and dragons, and they would write here be dragons, and that's what we've been doing. I don't think we've discovered anything, frankly, but we've started looking at some dragons, and that's why it's so useful for us today if we can have a conversation about this and keep going.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Giuliano. Really, you've done a brilliant job at going out to meet the dragons, and I really do encourage you all to read the report that Giuliano wrote for More in Common, because it lists all of these intensifiers in different areas. So thank you, Giuliano. You set this up, and thank you all for all the comments, and in the chat. There's lots of resources there, so it's great. But before we open it up, I want to turn to Laurence, who's been very much our thought partner on this exploration. And the first question is an obvious one, is from your point of view, why do you think this work is needed in general, but also maybe specifically to advance the fight that has been the fight of your life, I think, to advance protection of the environment and the climate agenda, which is, probably the greatest collective challenge we face. How can this sort of work on narrative and the story of the future help that cause?
Thank you, Mathieu, and thank you, Giuliano. I really want to thank you both, because when I came to you, Mathieu, and I didn't know Giuliano at that time, with my, with my anxiety, which was how we get out of the doomsday narrative that is finally probably useful in a way, but doesn't maybe prevent action. And I was doing that more on two sides, and an academic side, looking at what the reactions and the literature around how the IPCC report were received, discussion within the scientific community not to have a too dark picture, and on the other side, of course, how to mobilize energy in organization or whatever, in the activist sphere where I am now after being in a government. So it was really very, very helpful for me to in a way have you thinking about that and concentrating your effort, your intellectual efforts on that. So why I do think it's really important, I was reading a poll, I think yesterday, that I don't remember because my memory is now really tired after quite a long day, on a poll on what the youth is thinking about the future. And you may have seen that poll which appeared in the press yesterday. 75% of the young generation in several countries, it's not every country, of course, just think, but really distributed among the global south and the north, things that they think that climate change is a major concern, a major threat. 60% of them are thinking it's doomed, that we cannot do anything, that humanity future is over. So this anxiety, and again, being in an organization where the activism is the job. So we have to push the agenda, we have to influence people, we have to mobilize, we have to fund efforts and movements. So anxiety, of course, never produce, as Giuliano said very well, it's or you fly, well, you try to escape when you can, and if you do something else, you are just in finance or doing another job, you try to forget what you have learned. Or in a way, you are just paralyzed because of that. And the problem is that even the climate movement can be paralyzed by that level of anxiety, this response to the doomsday narrative. And so paralysis or flight is not an option for climate action. We need to engage, we need to, and I found that the six factor of this six intensifier, somehow the youth movement have been trying to use that without, of course, having the theory, getting fun. I am really struck by the fact that, unfortunately not now because of COVID, but the streets taken by the youth in 2019 in particular were full of very, very nice posters, imagination, very simple. There was not, big elaboration of, but it was like everyone producing its own slogan. And it was really, really, really nice, this invention, which now you see in many demonstrations. I'm thinking about the Algerian pro-democratic movement. Again, you see humor, you see fun, you see, but it's as again, with a personal imagination, which is not a slogan that, the labor union slogan or the one slogan we're repeating, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago in the street. Some of those common message are there, but the more interesting is everyone has his own message on the earth or whatever. So that's why I think narrative are important because they shape expectation. I can tell that for when I was preparing Paris Agreement, my obsession was what is the press communique on the Monday morning after, of course, the last Saturday and the last negotiation. And it was very much on the future. And there is no mechanism of powers that can force governments to act. But if really everybody believes in that future, that would be zero carbon and that it's desirable and that anyway will happen, expectation makes the decision, make the attitude, makes, of course, and it was very much this inspiration on how we can use self-fulfilling prophecy for having an international agreement working. And of course, I don't know if it works really or not in some ways, and it's another discussion, I think, yes, but on the other side, the ideas that the narrative are really shaping the way people see the reality. And in a way, we are seeing that now on the awareness of climate change, for example. And another element is, I think we need a story that doesn't, and that's why it is helping me a lot, what the job Giuliano has done and more in common is that having a story about climate change doesn't make the action, doesn't make the thinking, because of course it's about a systemic change. And it's difficult to synthesize them. But if you begin to combine that, finally, we need a story of the future, and everyone would put different elements in the story, then we begin to have something to in a way, love or feel that it would be really nicer. And I was struck by, that's something, of course, many activists have tried to design the climate story, the future, how this story, this society of zero carbon society would look like. And it's always awfully technical. You see electric cars, you see bikes, of course, you see clean air, etc. But in a way, it's like the material element, and there is nothing about the feeling element, the altogether element, the ways that finally this life zero carbon may help. It's necessarily not be a high-tech technology society, and it can be a society where we spend less time to consume material elements, and we can spend more time in really interpersonal relation, building together, even maybe working less, because we will be able to work less, and at the same time spend more time in doing things that really relate to each other. So I feel that we are missing, or we are failing, the story of the future. And again, that's what I'm struck by the politician when they prepare the campaigns. And with the case in France now, the case, of course, in Germany all the summer, they present, their measures, their 10 measures of 100 days they would do. And they don't present what they are aiming at, the future they are longing for. And that's why Giuliano is speaking about Jacinda Ardern, which for me is a sort of a model in politics these days. And she has expressed as a very young politician her longing for the future. It was not a precise program necessarily. And maybe that's what something Emmanuel Macron did in 2017. He was not very precise on the program, but he was trying to see, I want change, no, I want transgression, that was disruption. So you see that this resonates. And I think that's why narratives are important. And finally, I do think that empathy, recognizing that we are, and maybe that would be an option, a solution, a way, recognizing that we are affected ourselves. We can be powerless, and it's not a drama to be powerless in front of some elements, because in the recognition of the vulnerability, you can find the strengths. And that would be maybe a way to discuss these big problems. Of course, sharing information, being transparent for me is really important, because you have to give agency to people and everyone to make, I can do it because I understand what is happening. But at the same time, I think it's good to recognize that there is no people that are protected from this anxiety, but we can work with this anxiety and we can make a strength out of it. And that, of course, will be a very different way to tell the story. But I don't want to be too long. I'm sure that many more people would like to. But again, I was struck one word on the way the different governments are linked with the COVID crisis, some now 1.5 years ago. The idea that we should not panic society has resulted exactly in the opposite result. People, because they could not even share their concern, the concern of the government, the way they were lacking solutions, has given the way to this complotist, this anti-vax, and all this anxiety about there is somebody manipulating. And that, I think, a main failure of not recognizing that you can share your weakness even as a politician.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And there are lots of great points being made in the chat about, how this is challenging a word view. Daniel Stid posted a very interesting comment there. I encourage all of you to post more stuff in the chat. We will, as I said, download it and share it with all of you. But Laurence, I want to come back to a question that you kind of alluded to, which is that it is a busy season for politics in Europe and in the United States. Midterms are going to be coming up. Isn't this kind of thing, or wasn't this kind of thing in the old days, telling a story of the future, wasn't it the role of politicians? And should it be again? Are they failing to project out a little bit? And maybe particularly green politicians, are they failing in telling this story? And if it's not their role in this new world that we've been talking about, then whose role is it? Is it all of us? Where do we start? What's the spark that can light this, and where should it be? I know that you are consulted by many all politicians in a variety of countries and persuasions, and I'm just curious to know how this lands.
What I'm feeling it again. You remember, Mathieu, we started that reflection saying, is there an alternative narrative we can offer to politicians to deploy? Social justice combined with a green transition, what it could look like. And finally, the travels that Giuliano has invited us to go along shows that finally there is no narrative we can propose to them. But what I think we learn through this is that the values, the richness, the potential force and strength would come probably not. So I have mixed feelings. On one side, this is the truth of the authenticity of the story has to come from the experience. That's exactly what Giuliano is telling us, and we can experience. It's through the experience, which is where people can believe you. So in a way, the advice to the politician would be, come back to your own experience and show how much this future is important for you. And so, and different tones. And I'm feeling that the Greens party, when I was listening to the French debate on the Greens, they are very now normalized. They do like they know about talking about the foreign policy, whatever, and they don't speak out of their why they were engaged with that. So that's one element. But the other element, I think we have to populate the public discussion within this election with what are the different stories and experience that people are now, where the social innovation is coming from. Again, that's not a solution for the campaign, but it's a way we could, in a way, spark a different discussion if the politician would, in a way, listen to the people, which, in a way, are moving the society, and where finally they play a role of, we're blocking sometimes these innovations, and recognizing that they don't know how to conduct the change, but they are listening to how the change can happen. And that, of course, the experience I had with the Citizen Assembly. Something like a message, politicians who trust the people, if they want the people to trust them, should be something I think would be important in this campaign. I hope they can listen to that. I'm not totally sure.
Mm. Fantastic. I would love to thank you very much, Laurence, for that. And the experience of the Citizen Assembly in France obviously relates to this, and maybe we come back to that. I would love to invite you all to ask questions. There is probably more stuff in the chat that I can turn to, but if you'd like to raise your hand on the Zoom tool, I believe I will see it if things go well. I can see at least one hand from our friends at the House of Beautiful Business. Over to you. You should be able to talk if the magic of technology.
Yeah, let's try this. You guys hear me? This is Tim.
Yes, we can hear you, Tim.
The House of Beautiful Business. Giuliano, Laurence, Mathieu, thank you so much for this great content and this great conversation. I love the intensifiers. I think they're super practical, and I think without articulating them so well, I think intuitively we've probably been using them one way or the other in our own work at the House of Beautiful Business. I also really wholeheartedly agree with the need for more positive narratives. I think what's interesting here is the rise of climate fiction, probably most prominently exemplified by Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future, projecting a very positive narrative for how humankind can solve the climate crisis. I do, though, want to sort of share two very gentle objections, and as a friend. One is, but as I was listening to you, I couldn't help thinking, so, your argument is that we need a collective narrative that we can all share. And I just sort of wonder how desirable that is. Because behind a narrative, I think, is a vision, which is very much, I think, a very unique vantage point. And I think by definition, a vision is characterized by the fact that people can disagree with it, right? I think the question is if you develop a vision that is universally acceptable, whether that is all so compelling and inspiring. And everybody's family, as my friend Pierre Parker once told me, in everybody's family, no one is family. So I guess the question is it about creating a collective narrative, or is it more about embracing otherness, embracing multiple stories? My second objection would be, I sort of wonder, in the world of TikTok and populist rhetoric, doesn't come world building or creating facts before narrative? Are narratives sort of condemned to catching up? I'm thinking about gaming environments and Fortnite and, you know, Minecraft, where younger generations, I mean, they build worlds. And they're perhaps, I guess, narrative free. And also when you look at Trump and other populists, you could argue that there wasn't a grand narrative. It was rhetoric, it was rants, but it was sort of more phatic communication that just was without a coherent narrative. So do we need a collective narrative, or do we need to sort of create better TikTok videos, cater to micro attention? So those two objections, and I say this as a devil's advocate, but I very much believe in the power of narrative. So maybe you can be my angels and better arguments against myself.
Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you so much. Why don't I ask Laurence and Giuliano to think about that, and we will take one more question, and then but please do raise your hands if you have one. Jessica from Doc Society. We should be able to hear you now.
I've unmuted. Thank you, Mathieu and Giuliano and Laurence, for such thought-provoking comments. It's so interesting to hear how you're talking about narrative within kind of the wider climate movement, because speaking from the creative community on behalf of documentary film makers that we support at Doc Society, we've been working with kind of the potential of narrative for a number of years, but through the medium of film. And in the last 3 years, we've been looking at ways in which climate storytelling can be harnessed to create to change minds and to kind of change behaviors that will help shape the future. And you know, there are many storytellers all around the world who are working in this way. And Mathieu, I mean, I think it's worth saying you joined us at our Climate Story Lab back in London last year, sadly only virtually, and shared some early insights from More in Common's research in the UK, which went on to shape Britain Talks Climate. And that in itself has been like really inspiring to a film that was being made about the UK's Climate Citizen Assembly. And I'll share a link to that film in the chat in a moment. And it's been really interesting to see how the narrative that's come out of the More in Common work has infused storytelling on film and has gone on to have actually some extraordinary kind of traction in the public view. It's available on BBC iPlayer. It was shown last week in Parliament. And it's really helping people imagine what some of the solutions are to the climate crisis in future, given, you know, what was discussed at the Climate Assembly. So I will share some kind of our resources in the chat, the launch to the film. And I kind of would really encourage, you know, everyone to think also about the power of narrative in film and how we can all work together with filmmakers and with creatives in lockstep with movement to kind of really come together and harness the power of narrative in a kind of a much wider sense.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica. And Doc Society is a wonderful group. And so thank you for posting those resources. I'm going to ask, and I should say that I can see on the participant list that there's a lot of people who work in the storytelling and the creative fields. We've got an amazing group of people. We've got some of the very prominent activists, people in philanthropy, but also lots of creatives. So we'd love to hear from you. But maybe Giuliano and Laurence, we might turn to the friendly objections about, you know, how desirable is it to have a common narrative? You know, does that go against respecting otherness, diversity, etc.? Which also raises the question of who writes the narrative that I was alluding to in the beginning. I don't know, Laurence or Giuliano, if you'd like to address some of those points, as well as Tim's other point about there isn't a need for a big narrative in the world of Minecraft and make your own world.
I don't know, Giuliano, you want to start?
As you wish. It's a very difficult question anyway. So well, personally, I feel the objection for many reasons, not just in the sense, is it desirable to have a common narrative, but even is it in any possible way possible today? I mean, my conviction is that we live in a world of quantum politics. It's been kind of a transformation from Newtonian politics to quantum politics, and in Newtonian politics, you still thought you could have some common principles and a common reality, and of course that famous phrase about you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts, was still true. And today we probably live in a different reality where you're not just entitled to your own opinions, you're also entitled to your own facts, and of course this has something negative about it, and we will read it in op-eds every single day, but it's also part of what's happening to our lives and to the information system and to the information overload, where you have so much facts coming at you that you don't even need fake news to create your own reality. You can create parallel realities with different facts, and somehow, like in quantum physics, the point of view of the person that observes reality changes reality itself. It doesn't just modify perception, it modifies the reality in itself. So I think it's I mean, a terribly difficult objection that's been thrown at us. But on the other hand, what I'm convinced about is that the need for narrative is very deep. I think we dream in stories. Our hopes, our fears, we experience them in stories. Our imagination, our plans for the future. We gossip. We love. We hate in stories. So I think we can't just be left with this chaotic perception of factoids and things. I think the need for each one of us to weave this into a somehow coherent narrative is very deeply strong, and I think it's the same for our societies in a way. You know, I think we desperately need our individual narratives to somehow they don't need to be prescribed from one single instance. They don't need to all come from the same point, but they do need to find common threads for us to be able to fight against this gradation. So I mean, I understand that might be more wishful thinking than other. There was an Italian very famous Marxist thinker, Antonio Gramsci, that said, you know, the pessimism of reality and the optimism of willpower. But I think that's the whole point, and that's why we spend our time having these conversations.
Yeah.
We might be wrong, but not trying would be an even worse mistake.
Yeah. Laurence, do you want to come back on this question of is it desirable or does it sort of quash difference, etc.? There's a useful couple comments from Will in the chat about maybe it's not a shared narrative, but a sort of common universe.
Yeah, I was reading the chat as well, and what is sure is that there is a demand and aspiration for that. If not, the QAnon story would not work. No, people are longing for an explanation of the world, and the idea, the coming back of the ideology, whether it is identity or anything else. Or there was very interesting studies on the radicalization of the youth in France for Islamists. Radical Islam was because Islam was proposing a story of the world, an explanation with, in a way, sophisticated language, and that sort of longing for an explanation in front of this very, very complex, difficult world is just a need. People need just to understand where they are. And that the together you were referring to, Mathieu, the together is just where are we, what are we doing together, what is and that why some kind of that you see that in many society, very different societies, they're coming back to philosophical reflection, metaphysics, etc. Which and why? Because I'm feeling that the phase of intensive globalization, the emergence of this material civilization, and the fact that, you know, we replace politics by the government of expert and rational decision making, felt people totally unable to understand what was happening around them. And this lack of explanation is in a way, a fundamental brick asking for this narrative. So it's not just a rosy storytelling we are looking for, it's just how I understand where I am, and that's shared as a demand. Then we would have alternative stories. They are unfortunately very, very dark ones. And I was struck, I'm sure you remember these extraordinary elements of QAnon commenting on the Biden election, the day of the acceptance, and how they were trying to reinvent what was happening in front of their eyes, just to say, no, there will be a last minute intervention before the army is there to prevent him to go into power. So I think we have to recognize that. So the question is, do we just say, oh, this is crazy and we don't want to enter in that storytelling, or do we participate to that and try to understand what kind of other system of explanation of the world, and science is one, by the way, and there are many, and there are many, but then the question is what Giuliano was referring to: can we have narratives that insist on empathy and togetherness more than to conflict, which anyway more in common is for. So I do think so. It's not one narrative, is everybody needs a narrative. And the question now is just abandoned by the government of experts. Of course, the dominance of economics in the policy making, the way you envisage society. And this is not a narrative that can be owned. And the problem is the agency and the ownership, which defines the citizenship. And that is now, in my view, is lacking. So it's, again, giving the story back to the people, in a way, widening the scope where we can discuss together narrative, and not in a way despising this need of collective thinking. I think I understand, of course, the drama of ideologies, Stalinism, everything, and of course and the drama that has created. But nevertheless, it worked because people needed to know where they were living for. And that's a job, it's a difficult job, but we cannot just let this go. In a way, it's a necessity, it's an ontological necessity, in my view.
And do you think there's a question in the chat, and for everybody's calendars, we made the session to go to 1:15, so we've got a few more minutes if you want to ask questions. But there's a great question from Mayur Lakani in the chat about the pandemic. Do you think that this necessity that you described, Laurence and Giuliano, the question is, what do you feel is the impact of the pandemic on future thinking and on visions and on this need of narrative. So on the one hand, you might think, well, the pandemic has reminded us that we're in deep trouble and a tiny virus or big climate change could really wipe us out. We need a new story and we need to go sail out on the endless sea. On the other extreme might say, well, it's not a time to be thinking big thoughts about the future. We should just make sure that, you know, our healthcare workers are paid adequately and so on. A third alternative is that one group is thinking we need a story of the future. The other thinking is no, I just want better healthcare and my life to return to normal. Giuliano and Laurence, what do you think? The current crisis we're doing it because we have chosen to do this work in this moment. It's not a coincidence, perhaps.
I don't know what Giuliano think. I think people feel the uneasiness. No, I don't think Mathieu that. Of course, people are saying we should pay more for the nurses, and if not, they would not continue working as hard as we need, and we need maybe to pay more for health, etc. And then just ignore what finally the pandemic has taught us on the fragility of the human species. People feel the uneasiness, the two. I do think people inside themselves feel that on one side, they in a way, they factor in the fragility and the vulnerability of the human species vis-a-vis nature and vis-a-vis what we did to nature. And on the other side, of course, they see that what was finally the positive narrative in the pandemic was, of course, probably a distrust at some point in time to government because of, in a way, not the transparency being not there. But what was real an experience was a solidarity between people. And again, what Giuliano said in the beginning, the experience and the action based on the personal interrelation experience. So I do think that on this, if I would do a campaign myself in this moment, I would insist on this capacity of society to repair itself, to really go for mending in a way the wounds of the society, that there is a regeneration capacity that has been demonstrated by people, and to build on that. And so I don't know if it's a narrative, but certainly building on the fact that we were able to resist and to, in a way, find a way, a complicated way through this, together with many type of actors. It's a solid foundation for the solidarity and in a way for the society. And in a way, I looked at, finally, it could benefit certainly, for example, the French government for the future election, because at the end of the day, we find a way, we muddle through, they muddle through, but they muddle through. And in a way, so I think that is interesting, because I think the anxiety on the relation with nature and the vulnerability will stay. And that a very interesting factor to understand where we are in the world. And I think we should build, and it's not doomsday, is we are in a very uncertain world. There is a very beautiful book that I think I recommend for all of you to read, is on Mrs. Hathaway, which say, live with the trouble, within the trouble. And she says, we don't need cathedrals. We need to understand we are living within ruins, but the ruins can, in a way, that's the world we have produced anyway. So how we cope with that? And coping is not necessarily a bad thing. We can, in history, civilization have been living with different circumstances. And I think difficulty, could be a way to realign together. Anyway, that's what I think with the pandemic.
Great. Well, we are going to end on that note because we are at time. Thank you very, very much for everybody who stayed on with us. It's been great. We had close to 100 people join us at some point. So it's great to see that there's interest in this. As we said, please stay in touch with us. Please contact us. We're going to post our contact email in the chat. It's contact@moreInCommon.com. Stay in touch on social media. Send us projects that you've been working on. For anybody who speaks French and who might be interested, we are doing a double act. We're bringing Laurence and Giuliano back. Both of them speak impeccable French. And we're adding Priscilla Ludowski, who I think joined us for part of this call today, who is the person who initiated the Yellow Vest movement in France, as well as the author David Jaiz. And on the 21st, we're going to have a similar conversation in French, mainly about France, but also about Europe and the rest of the world. So anybody, si vous parlez français, you will be welcome to join us on the 21st. But thank you so much to everyone, and mostly thank you to Laurence and to Giuliano. This was fascinating, and to all of you for joining us. Thank you very much from Paris. Good night, and I wish you pleasant travels on whatever sea you choose to travel on. Bye-bye. Thank you.